It was simple, straightforward, uncomplicated, collaborative heaven. It's heaven on earth.
The second movement of SMiLE begins with the lovely harpsichord-driven Wonderful. Brian had talked about SMiLE in terms of a teenage symphony to God, and Wonderful references religion and God in lyrics such as never known as a non-believer. An interesting side note about the lyrics is that Van Dyke Parks was never credited as a co-writer of the track until he broached the issue with Brian in 2003. He was then awarded a co-write as a lyricist. There were 3 versions of Wonderful recorded. One labelled Rock With Me Henry, which had drums, which was interesting but far inferior to the version of Wonderful we know and love. The third version was a piano version. The basic track for the first version was recorded on August 25th, 1966 at Western. It took 18 takes to record. Wilson had trouble playing the harpsichord. At one point in the session he remarked to engineer Chuck Britz, "Some of these notes are fucking up. I swear to God, you push them and they don't go." On October 6th, Brian overdubbed a lead vocal onto the track. Drums and other instruments were also added to the track during the session. Wilson then created a rough mix for the track. Further vocals were recorded for the song on December 15th at Columbia Studio. Wonderful features the Beach Boys and 3 other players outside of the Beach Boys, which include Larry Kenstill on grand piano, Lyle Ritz on upright bass, overdub tenor ukulele, and Alan Waite on trumpet. Look was one of the earliest pieces recorded during the SMiLE sessions. Musicologist Philip Lambert speculated that some parts of the music possibly evolved from one of the riffs in Good Vibrations. Look, like many of the other tracks on SMiLE, included the Wrecking Crew. It was recorded on August 12th, 1966 at Western Studio. It was titled Look on the tape box, but on the AMF sheet it was logged as Untitled Song Number 1 with a runtime of 2 minutes 16 seconds. Take 20 was marked as the best. Capitol Records documentation suggests that on October 13th, all 6 Beach Boys were involved in a vocal overdubbing session for the track, now logged as I ran, with a runtime of 3 minutes 10 seconds. Writing in the SMiLE Sessions liner notes, Craig Slowinski said that a tape from that session has not turned up in a search of the Capitol and B or I vaults. Child is the father of the man. The title derives from an idiom meaning that the man is the product of habits and behaviours developed in youth. It has one of the most lovely musical passages on SMiLE with the piano, which enters at 25 seconds. I remember the first time I heard that piano section from some bootleg, it gave me goosebumps. It was so simple but so effective.
Wow. Is that just before Surf's Up?
It sort of has that vibe, doesn't it? It could work.
Reminds me of it. It has that kind of thing going.
The instrumental track for Child is the Father of the Man was recorded on October 7th and October 11th, 1966 at Western Studios. Vocals were overdubbed by the group on October 12th and December 2nd at Columbia Studios. Mark Lynette, who mixed the SMiLE Sessions box set, said there are vocal parts obscured by Carl Wilson singing on the track. When he's not singing, you can hear faint background vocal parts that no longer exist on the multitrack. They must have been in his headphones and were picked up by the vocal mic. It could be that Brian decided he didn't need them, or that he was going to re-record them, but never did. You hear this sort of stuff throughout the tapes. On the underrated Friends album of 1968, the Beach Boys repurposed some of Child is the Father of the Man. This can be heard at 1 minute 25 seconds on the track Little Bird. The final song of the second movement is another centrepiece of SMiLE, Surf's Up. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest songs that Brian ever wrote. Van Dyke's lyrics, along with Brian's music, paint such a mood and vibe. The first time I heard the track, it totally floored me. Again, it's one of those goosebumps kind of moments when you first hear it. Surf's Up was the second song Brian and Van Dyke wrote together. It was composed as a 2-movement piece, most of it in one night, and it said they were high on Brian's desbutalls. Michael Vossi, who was Brian's former personal assistant, wrote in a self-penned article in 1969 that Surf's Up was to be the closing track and that the song would have been followed by a choral amen sort of thing. It could have worked as a closer for the album, but again it's hard to tell without hearing it sequenced properly. Surf's Up, like many other Brian Wilson compositions, shows Brian's talent for chord progressions, inversions and modulations. Lyrically, Surf's Up is opaque and poetic. And you can look at it two ways, as surf's up, as in when you say surf's up, it means you're going surfing. But you can also look at it in surf's up that it's surf's up, it's over, like surf's up, time is up, you know. But maybe Van Dyke's saying it was a new beginning and not an end. The last 3 lines of lyric relate back to the previous songs in the second movement. I heard the word, wonderful thing, a children's song. In Jules Siegel's October 1967 memoir for Cheetah magazine titled Goodbye Surfing, Hello God, he quoted Brian's explanation of the album's lyrics, reportedly saying, Surf's Up is about a man at a concert that is overtaken by music. Collimated Room's domino symbolises the collapse of empires, ideas, lives and institutions. After the lyric, canvas the town and brush the backdrop, the song's protagonist sets off on his vision on a trip. He then suffers a choke of grief at his own suffering and the emptiness of life. At the end, he then finds hope to the tides, to the beach, to childhood, before experiencing the joy of enlightenment of seeing God, which manifests in a children's song. Wilson concluded his summary. Of course, that's the very intellectual explanation, but maybe sometimes you have to do an intellectual thing. Music historian Clinton Halen suggests that Brian had merely repeated an explanation that was originally given by Van Dyke Parks. With regard to the information for Surf's Up, I shall only concentrate on the 1960s sessions and not include the 1971 sessions that took place for the Surf's Up album. The first tracking session for Surf's Up was at Western on November 4th, 1966. It was logged with the subtitle, First Movement. The November 7th session was dedicated to experimenting with horn effects, including an exercise in which Brian instructed his musicians to laugh and have conversations through their instruments. The tape of this experiment was later given the label George Fell Into His French Horn.
You need to lay there and tell me that George fell into his French horn.
There are at least 2 known Surf's Up recordings that have been presumed missing or lost. A vocal session at Columbia Studio from December 15th, 1966, and 2 sessions at Western from January 23rd, 1967. According to author Keith Badman, the December 15th session included vocal and piano overdubs onto the first movement backing track, as well as further recording on Wonderful. Jules Siegel later claimed that the session went very badly. Later that evening, Brian had been filmed at Columbia Studios singing and performing Surf's Up on the piano for use in David Oppenheim's CBS-commissioned documentary Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution, which was hosted by Leonard Bernstein. Siegel said, I was there when we did Surf's Up for the CBS cameras. I was in the car with him. We smoked a joint before he went and did that, and afterwards I said to him, why don't you just stop fucking around with this stuff and just release that as a single like now? Don't wait for the album to do it. But he said he was afraid to do it. Brian and Oppenheim were dissatisfied with what they had filmed and decided to reshoot the sequence at Brian's home 2 days later on December 17th. His performance that day, executed in one take with the candelabra placed on his grand piano, was captured by 3 film cameras and deemed satisfactory for use in the documentary.
And we would be wise not to behave like ostriches about it. Besides, as I said, I like it. Of course, what I like is maybe 5% of the whole output, which pours over this country like the 2 oceans from both coasts, and it's mostly trash. But that good 5% is so exciting and vital, and may I say significant, that it claims the attention of every thinking person.
Here is a new song, too complex to get all of first time around. It could come only out of the ferment that characterizes today's pop music scene. Brian Wilson, leader of the famous Beach Boys and one of today's most important pop musicians, sings his own Surf's Up.
Dove-nested towers, the hour was struck, the straight quicksilver.
I remember when I saw a snippet of that performance on a Brian Wilson documentary that the Biography Channel did, and I was just like, oh my god, wow. It was just amazing. Having someone like Leonard Bernstein endorse what Brian was doing with Surf's Up was a big validation for Van Dyke and Brian. Van Dyke said,
So that gave us some kind of validation that we were doing the right thing to explore, to try to get outside the box.
What does all this mean? I think it's all part of a historic revolution.
Carbonated ruins down.
The lost sessions from January 1967 reportedly involved additional instrumental tracking, including a 16-piece string and horn section that was overdubbed onto a bounce tape of the backing track from December 15th. When asked what he had remembered of the song's second movement in 2003, Brian responded that it was supposed to feature a string ensemble. Interestingly, after SMiLE had been abandoned, in late 1967, Brian recorded several takes of another piano vocal performance of Surf's Up at his home studio, presumably recorded during the Wild Honey sessions. I've talked about tracks being centerpieces for the album, but I think Surf's Up is probably the one that stands out the most. I think it's the true centerpiece of the record.
At that point, things were going along in such a strong direction that it never occurred to me that anything would stop SMiLE on any level whatsoever.